What happens when two deeply broken people find each other online? What happens when consent becomes impossible to define? Today on True Crime Verge, we're examining one of the most psychologically disturbing cases ever documented. A story that challenges everything we think we know about mental illness, the internet, and the limits of human behavior. This is the case of Armin Meiwes and Bernd Brandis. Stay with us. Before we continue, if you believe stories like these deserve to be told, like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps us keep bringing you more true crime stories from around the world.
2001, a man in Germany posted a simple online ad looking for someone to be killed and eaten. And someone actually said yes. On the surface, Armin Meiwes was unremarkable. To his neighbors in Rothenburg, Germany, he seemed like the perfect resident. A 42-year-old computer expert who fixed their cars, mowed their lawns, and kept to himself. Behind the walls of his old mansion, the light burned late into the night, but no one questioned what he was doing inside. What nobody knew was that Armin harbored a dark secret that had haunted him since childhood. Psychological evaluations would later reveal severe inferiority complexes rooted in trauma. He grew up in a lonely, troubled family. His father was absent and indifferent. His mother was overprotective and controlling. Young Armin craved something his family could never give him: genuine connection, belonging, someone who would never leave. And so he developed an obsession. Since childhood, Armin had fantasized about consuming another human being. Not out of hunger, but out of a desperate need for connection. In his mind, if he could absorb another person entirely, they would become part of him. They would never leave. They would be his forever. For decades, this remained a fantasy. But in the late 1990s, the internet gave Armin a tool he didn't expect to have. It gave him access to people who shared his darkest thoughts. In 2000, Armin began posting in online forums and chat rooms. He used the alias Frankie. His posts were explicit. He was looking for a victim, someone willing, someone who wanted to be consumed. For years, no one responded seriously. The post seemed like the dark fantasy of an isolated man, something he would never actually act on. But then, in 2000, someone answered. His name was Bernd Brandis. He was 43 years old, a bisexual engineer from Berlin. Online, he went by the alias Cater99. And unlike the others who had dismissed Armin's posts, Bernd was serious. The two men began communicating regularly. Armin described what he wanted to do. Bernd expressed his willingness. They discussed it in detail, not as a hypothetical, but as a plan, an arrangement. Here's where we have to pause and think about what this tells us. The internet created a space where two deeply troubled individuals could find each other and reinforce each other's darkest impulses. Without the internet, they likely never would have met. Armin's fantasy might have remained isolated in his mind. Bernd's deepest desires might have stayed private. But online, anonymity gave them permission. It gave them community. It gave them validation. For Armin, Bernd wasn't just a victim. He was proof that his fantasy could be real. For Bernd, Armin wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who understood him in a way the outside world never could. But the internet also reveals something uncomfortable about consent. Both men agreed to what was about to happen. Both communicated their intentions. Neither was being deceived by the other. And yet, we instinctively know that something is profoundly wrong with this arrangement. Why? Because consent breaks down when mental illness is involved, and both of these men were deeply, severely mentally ill. Let's talk about Bernd first, because his story is the one we understand least. Bernd had a troubled past. He'd been bullied, isolated, and struggled with his identity. He worked as an engineer, held down a job, maintained some semblance of normal life, but internally, he was fractured. Psychiatric evaluations suggested he may have suffered from depression and possibly body dysmorphia, a distorted perception of his own body and self-worth. The theory that emerged during the trial was this: Bernd didn't just want to die. He wanted to disappear, to be absorbed, to stop existing as a separate, vulnerable person. In some twisted way, being consumed by Armin represented the ultimate escape from his own pain. It was the darkest form of self-harm imaginable. On March 9, 2001, Bernd purchased a one-way ticket to Germany. He never intended to come back. Now, Armin's psychology was different, but equally disturbing. Psychiatrists who examined Meiwes described a man frozen in emotional development. His childhood trauma, the absent father, the controlling mother, had left him unable to form healthy relationships. He didn't know how to be close to another person in normal ways. His cannibalism fantasy wasn't about violence in the traditional sense. It was a twisted expression of his desperate need for connection and control. Armin had tried other connections. Before Bernd, another man had answered his ads, a man who called himself Luke. But Luke's family backed out of the arrangement. For Armin, it was another rejection, another failure to connect. But then Bernd stayed committed. Bernd followed through. For Armin, this was finally his moment. Here's the critical question. Can two mentally ill people truly consent to something like this? Consent assumes rational decision-making, informed choices, and a clear understanding of consequences. But Bernd was deeply suicidal. Armin was deeply delusional. The system that should have caught this, mental health services, family intervention, early warning signs, failed both of them completely. Bernd arrived at Armin's mansion on March 9, 2001. They had never met in person before, only online. What happened over the next hours remains partially unclear, told only through Armin's accounts. He claimed he and Bernd engaged in consensual sexual acts, and that Bernd asked to be killed. Armin said he initially refused, but eventually complied. The exact sequence of events, how much was willing participation, how much was coercion, how much was confusion, we'll never fully know. Bernd is dead. Armin's accounts have been questioned, and the truth probably lies in uncomfortable gray areas that don't match our expectations of how crimes happen. But what we do know is this. Armin killed Bernd, stored portions of his body in a freezer, and later consumed them. He likely would have gotten away with it, since Bernd was a willing participant who was never reported missing. But Armin wanted to do it again. He went back online, posting new ads for another volunteer. This time, a student saw the posts and alerted the police. When police arrived at Armin's mansion in December 2002, they found human remains and a videotape that documented everything. Armin confessed immediately. The case was unlike anything Germany had ever seen. There was no specific law against consensual cannibalism. Murder required proof of intent and malice, but Armin argued that Bernd had asked to die. It created an impossible legal dilemma. If the court accepted Armin's story, he could only be convicted of manslaughter. If consent was invalid, then it was murder. The trial lasted months. Experts debated whether true consent was even possible under such conditions. In January 2004, Armin was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. The verdict caused massive public outcry. People couldn't believe someone could kill and eat another person and get less than a decade in prison. Prosecutors appealed. In 2006, at a retrial, the court found a way to convict him of murder, arguing that killing someone for sexual gratification, even with their consent, fulfilled the legal definition. This time, Armin was sentenced to life in prison. The case was so unprecedented that it forced Germany to create a new law, closing the bizarre loophole the cannibal of Rottenburg had exposed. Sometimes the law catches up only after the horror is done. If that unsettles you, it should, because the next case might be writing itself right now. Hit subscribe so you never stop questioning how far justice can go, or how far it fails. The Armin Meiwes case is disturbing not because it's unique, but because it exposes systemic failures that could have prevented it. First, The internet enabled two deeply troubled individuals to find each other and reinforce each other's illnesses. Without anonymity, without distance, this likely never happens. Second, both men showed clear signs of severe mental illness, yet both fell through every social safety net. Neither had adequate mental health support. Neither had family or friends close enough to intervene. Third, the case reveals the limits of consent as a legal concept. Consent is meaningless when someone is actively suicidal. Consent is impossible when someone is living in psychological delusion. The law had to catch up to a reality it had never contemplated. Finally, this case is a tragedy for both men. Armin Meiwes didn't wake up one day and decide to become a cannibal. He was broken by his childhood, isolated by his nature, and enabled by technology and circumstance. Bernd Brandis didn't volunteer to die because he was happy or well. He did it because he was in such psychological pain that non-existence seemed like relief. They both needed help. They both needed to be seen. Instead, they found each other online. And in that connection, they found only darkness.
This case shows that crime isn't always black and white. There are psychological layers, moral gray areas, and uncomfortable truths that don't have easy answers. That's what makes these stories worth telling. Not for shock value, but for understanding. If this case left you thinking, that's exactly the point. Drop a comment below. What's your take on this case? How do we prevent something like this in the future? Subscribe to True Crime Verge for more deep dives into cases that make you question everything. Thanks for watching.